He stood alone in the dust, a German shepherd with a twisted leg, trembling under the weight of every whisper in the crowd. Not a single hand went up. Not one. They called him broken, unfixable, a burden. The auctioneer was seconds from ending it all until a man no one had noticed quietly raised his hand. No words, no hesitation, just one simple gesture that would set off a chain of events no one could have imagined. What was it about this dog that pulled a stranger from the shadows? And what secret did that man carry that made him walk straight into the pain everyone else ran from? This story will take you deeper than you expect. A journey of loyalty, redemption, and a bond that just might change how you see the world. But before we dive in, like this video, and let us know in the comments where are you watching from. We'd love to hear from you. The Billings livestock auction wasn't exactly the kind of place you went looking for grace. Between the haze of cattle dust, the clang of metal gates, and the relentless shouts of buyers sizing up working stock, there was barely room to breathe, let alone feel. But that day, something shifted the noise into silence. It wasn't the loudest voice or the biggest bull. Was the dog. He limped in through the side gate like a shadow, trying to remember how to walk in the light. Male German shepherd, mud-stained, fur mottled with old wounds, one hind leg dragging behind him like it had given up months ago. His ribs peeked through patchy fur, and a faded chain scar wrapped around his neck like a memory he couldn't shake. He didn't bark. He didn't beg. He just stood there, shaking slightly, but holding his ground as if he knew his fate was about to be sealed. In front of strangers who didn't care to know his name, the auctioneer, usually thunderous with energy, stumbled over his pitch. A few mutters scattered through the barn. That one's done for. He's not worth the feed. Probably bit someone. No bids. Not even a glance of pity. The silence around him didn't come from awe. It came from indifference. He wasn't a dog to them. He was a burden with a heartbeat. Just as the auctioneer started to move on, tapping his gavel toward the gate to have the dog dealt with, a hand lifted quietly in the back. It didn't shout. It didn't wave. Just rose calm and firm like it had been waiting for this exact moment. Heads turned. Whispers followed. No one recognized the man. He wore a worn-out leather jacket that had seen more miles than most trucks in the yard, and boots caked with Montana mud. His hair was silver at the sides, and a faded scar ran down his jawline like a map leading back to somewhere he never talked about. His name wasn't announced. His voice wasn't heard, but the way he nodded once, just once, carried more weight than any offer of cash. The gavel dropped. Sold. People blinked, confused. Why would someone like that want a dog like that? Was it pity, a mistake, or something they'd never understand? The man walked slowly down the aisle. He didn't hesitate. He didn't flinch when the dog raised his head. The German shepherd stared, legs wobbling, but something in those amber eyes flickered like a dying ember catching the wind. When the man knelt beside him, he didn't reach to grab or pull. He simply placed a hand open and patient on the dog's shoulder. What happened next, no one expected. The dog moved closer, barely, but leaned into that touch as if it was the first real contact he'd had in years. He didn't growl. He didn't cry. He just rested his weight against the man's leg and breathed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, but everyone felt it. It was like watching two broken things remember how to hold each other together. Someone recorded it on their phone. The footage didn't show much, just a stranger and a dog still and silent in the chaos of an auction yard, but it was enough to go viral. What it didn't show, though, was the reason behind that raised hand, the story hidden in the man's eyes, and what the dog would do in the days ahead would leave everyone questioning how much pain it takes to finally bring someone home. The road home was lined with rust-cold trees clinging to the last breath of autumn. The old pickup groaned over every bump like it had opinions. But Elijah Kane didn't say a word. He kept his hands firm on the wheel, his eyes locked on the road ahead, though they flicked toward the rear-view mirror more than once, where the dog lay curled in the truck bed, silent, eyes half closed, but never fully asleep. Every jolt made him flinch, as if expecting the world to turn cruel again at any second. But this wasn't the auction yard anymore, and Elijah wasn't like the others. The cabin waited on the edge of Laurel, Montana, where pine met silence and no one came, unless they were lost. It stood like a relic half swallowed by trees, with a porch that leaned just enough to give it character. Elijah had lived there for years alone. No visitors, no deliveries. Just an old stove, a wood pile stacked with military precision, and a bed that had forgotten what it meant to be shared. He didn't bring things home until now. Elijah carried the dog in his arms like something sacred, like he was afraid to wake a ghost. The dog didn't resist. He just trembled slightly, his breathing shallow, as if unsure he had the right to rest. Elijah laid him on an old flannel blanket near the hearth, added towels, and stoked the fire until it danced. The warmth crept in slow, wrapping around the edges of the room. Still, the dog didn't close his eyes. That night, Elijah cooked a simple stew. The dog didn't eat. He didn't move. He just watched, his eyes tracking every step, every sigh. Every moment the man's hand hovered near something sharp or it wasn't fear. It was defense. Like someone had taught him long ago that quiet could turn violent fast. Elijah didn't push. He didn't call out commands. Instead, he just sat down across from him and whispered almost to the fire itself. Rook. The dog's ears twitched. Not much, just enough to betray the flicker of recognition or maybe curiosity. Elijah tried again. Softer. Rook, that's your name now. The dog didn't move. Didn't reject it, either. But the silence shifted, slightly, like the wind outside had changed its mind about how cold the night needed to be. 4 hours, Elijah didn't move from that spot. He didn't read, didn't sleep, just watched the flames flicker against old wooden walls, while the dog lay still, eyes wide open, always watching. When the fire finally cracked in just the right way, Rook flinched. Elijah said nothing. He simply reached over, pulled an extra blanket closer, and left his hand resting on the edge of the bedding. Not touching, just near. Rook stared at that hand for minutes, unmoving. Then, as if testing gravity itself, he shifted just an inch, until the tip of his paw touched the man's fingers. No lightning, no grand orchestral swell, just two lives that had been dragged across gravel, finding each other in the softest, most fragile moment imaginable. Morning came with frost blanketing the windows and the forest beyond still asleep. Elijah didn't wake to barking or movement. He woke to warmth at his side. Rook had moved during the night, curling himself near the fireplace and closer to the man who hadn't demanded anything from him. It wasn't trust yet. It wasn't peace. But it was a beginning. And beginnings matter. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with trumpets and bright lights. Sometimes it's in the quiet scrape of claws on old floorboards, in the shared breath of a man and a dog who've both seen too much, and the silent agreement that maybe this cabin could hold more than just ghosts. The morning after their first night under the same roof started quiet, as most mornings did in the cabin just outside Laurel. Outside, frost glinted off pine needles like someone had sprinkled silver dust across the forest. Inside, Elijah brewed coffee, strong enough to wake the dead. But his eyes weren't on the mug. They were on the dog. Rook, curled tightly near the fireplace, one eye cracked open, always watching, never trusting too much. Healing had a rhythm, and Rook wasn't ready to dance yet. Elijah sat down a bowl of soft food, chicken, rice, some bone broth, but Rook didn't move until Elijah sat beside him on the hardwood floor. Then, inch by inch, as if his body had learned betrayal by touch, the dog leaned forward and began to eat, but only if Elijah stayed near. He didn't gobble like a starving stray. He paused every few bites, eyeing the man, bracing for the sound of a boot step, a yell, a hand raised the wrong way. As the days unfolded, Rook's limp didn't improve. In fact, Elijah noticed something worse. The third afternoon, after a slow, careful walk in the yard, Elijah tried brushing out the dog's matted coat near the hindquarters. That's when it happened. A single stroke near the back leg sent Rook into a spin. He jerked, snarled, not with aggression, but terror. A low, guttural sound erupted from his throat, not to hurt, but to warn. Elijah froze. The brush dropped. Rook backed away, trembling, tail tucked, heart racing. Elijah didn't yell. He didn't move toward him. He just knelt slowly, palm up, and waited. Rook didn't come back immediately. Instead, he stood at the edge of the rug, body stiff, eyes darting like a trapped animal, waiting for pain. 10 long minutes passed before he took one cautious step forward, then another, until finally his snout pressed gently into Elijah's hand. A quiet surrender. Not trust, just exhaustion from carrying the weight of whatever came before. Later that night, as Elijah carefully ran his fingers along the dog's body to check the healing wound, he noticed something strange under the fur. Not one, but several circular patches. Tiny burns, some old, some new, intentional, done by someone who knew exactly where a dog couldn't reach to scratch or bite. Elijah's hands stopped. His breath hitched. His face didn't change, but his eyes told a different story. Anger, guilt, something deeper. He didn't say a word, just closed his eyes for a second, like he needed to anchor himself before doing something reckless. As the fire flickered low, Elijah pulled out a weathered leather-bound journal from under his bed. He sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, and began to write. Not for anyone else to read, but like a man trying to offload weight he couldn't carry any more. The ink flowed fast. The sentences were broken. Names, places, questions. I should have said something. Back then. Why didn't I report it? Did I know you? Meanwhile, Rook stirred in his sleep, whimpering. Low cries, soft yelps. Like he was trapped somewhere behind his eyelids. Elijah moved to him gently, knelt by the fireplace, and whispered, "You're not there anymore." Rook's body twitched once, then settled. The nightmare passed, but the questions lingered like smoke. In the days that followed, more patterns emerged. Rook flinched at the sound of a chain rattling. He bolted under the table when Elijah dropped a metal bowl. He growled, not at people, but at uniforms. Even the sight of a hat with a badge sent his hackles up. These weren't random behaviors. They were scars stitched into the nervous system. Whoever had hurt Rook hadn't just broken bones. They'd broken language, trust, memory. But there was something else. Something Elijah couldn't name. Every time Rook looked at him with those eyes, not scared, not confused, but familiar. Hit like a wave that didn't crest. As if the dog wasn't seeing a new home, but recognizing something he'd already known. And Elijah felt it, too. That strange feeling that somewhere somehow this wasn't their first collision. Was a reunion. And whatever Rook had been running from, it wasn't just his past. It might have been Elijah's, too. The silence that wrapped Elijah's cabin each night wasn't just peaceful. It was loaded. Like the air itself knew secrets. It wasn't telling. That kind of silence doesn't come from a lack of sound, but from a life that's already said too much. And on one such night, just after midnight, the sound that broke it wasn't thunder or wind. It was a knock. 3 slow, heavy taps against the door. Elijah didn't move at first. Neither did the dog who had been dozing by the fireplace. They both lifted their heads. At the same time, stiff, alert like soldiers on instinct. Elijah approached the door without a word. On the other side stood a man in a brown canvas jacket, a gold badge clipped to his belt. Deputy Marshal Lance Dwyer. Not a stranger, but not exactly a friend either. "Evening," Dwyer said, voice low. "Sorry for the hour. Figured you'd want to know. There was a break-in at the old Wilcox Ranch. Thought you might remember that place. You used to shoe horses out there, didn't you?" Elijah stared. Rook stepped between them without a sound. Posture tense, tail low, ears back. The moment was quick, but unmistakable. The dog recognized the name. Not the deputy. The ranch. Dwyer tipped his hat and left a card without another word. Elijah closed the door slowly, locking both the bolt and the chain. Then he stood still. For a long time, just breathing. The dog stared up at him, unmoving like he was waiting for something to snap. Later that night, Elijah went out to the shed behind the cabin. Rook followed, his limp less pronounced in the cold. The shed hadn't been opened in years. Smelled like rust and dust and a past no one wanted to talk about. Elijah moved straight to the back, lifted a tarp, and uncovered an old wooden crate reinforced with iron corners. He paused before pulling it out. Then, with a breath like he was diving underwater, he unlocked. Inside were remnants of a life left behind. An army patch folded and frayed. A photo of a younger Elijah standing beside a German shepherd similar to Rook, but not the same. A tattered Leather collar burned at the edges. And at the bottom, wrapped in plastic, a stack of worn documents, receipts from ranch jobs, long forgotten, including several with the Willicks's name and one signature in particular that made Elijah's hand curl into a fist. The dog watched him from the doorway. His eyes never blinked. His body didn't move. It was like he knew what was in the box before Elijah did. Elijah didn't sleep that night. He sat on the front porch with Rook beside him, both of them wrapped in the kind of silence that comes when the past doesn't knock. It kicks the door in. He knew he couldn't leave it buried anymore. Not the evidence, not the guilt, and definitely not the name scrolled at the bottom of that receipt. A name he had hoped never to see again. But here it was staring back like a mirror with no forgiveness. Something had begun the day he lifted his hand at that auction. Not a rescue, not even a redemption. It was a reckoning, and every step forward from this point wasn't about healing anymore. It was about answers. And if Rook's nightmares were any indication, they weren't going to like what they found. Because whatever happened at Willicks's, it didn't stay buried. By morning, the frost on the roof had already melted into slow drips, tapping out a rhythm that didn't match Elijah's mood. Sleep hadn't visited. The box was still open. On the table, Rook paced near the front door, restless, his paws tapping the wood like a drum beat. Only he could hear. There was no spoken plan, but somehow both man and dog knew where they were going. The road to the Wilcox Ranch was long, winding through the outer curves of Custer National Forest. Pines arched overhead, casting long, narrow shadows across the gravel. Elijah didn't say a word as he drove. The dog sat in the passenger seat, body alert, but silent, eyes scanning the horizon like something familiar might rise out of the trees at any moment. The truck creaked with every bump, but neither of them flinched. They had bigger weight riding with them, unspoken but heavy. The old ranch came into view like a ghost. Faded fence posts, cracked windows, barns with roofs caving in on themselves. But it wasn't just decay. It felt like the kind of place people had left in a hurry, not because of nature or time, but because of something no one wanted to talk about. Elijah stopped the truck and stepped out slowly. The dog followed, each step measured, his limp more noticeable on uneven ground. They didn't head for the front door. Instead, Rook moved toward the back fields, ignoring the broken corral and the rusted horse trailer. It was the overgrown clearing, past the treein that caught his focus. Elijah followed closely, watching as the dog slowed near a patch of tall grass and thistles. Then, suddenly, Rook stopped. His ears dropped. His body crouched low. He sniffed the dirt, pawed at it once, then looked up. There were shallow depressions in the earth, irresistible, as if something or someone had once been buried there. Not deep, not marked, just erased. Elijah dropped to one knee and touched the ground. Cold, damp, still. "Is this it?" he whispered, barely loud enough to be real. The dog didn't bark, didn't whimper, just let out a slow, heavy breath and sat beside him. The air thickened. Elijah closed his eyes for a long moment, remembering things he had spent years trying to forget. Old jobs, fast cash, a certain barn with sounds no one ever spoke of again. But it was more than guilt. It was something worse. Complicity. He hadn't caused it, but he'd been there. He'd heard things and he'd walked away. The dog leaned gently against Elijah's shoulder, not pressing, just being. And that small, quiet contact carried the weight of forgiveness that Elijah didn't think he deserved. They sat there for a long time, man and dog, side by side in the middle of a field filled with ghosts. But the silence didn't last. As they walked back to the truck, a movement near the barn caught Elijah's eye. Shape quick ducking behind the rotted siding. Someone had been watching. He stepped forward, but Rook growled low and guttural, halting him in place. Whoever it was, they didn't come out again. And Elijah didn't chase. Instead, he opened the glove box, pulled out a folded notepad, and wrote 3 words. It's not over. The drive back was even quieter, but the silence wasn't empty anymore. It buzzed with urgency. Elijah knew now this wasn't just about Rook's past. It was about his own accountability and the unfinished business that waited in the shadows of forgotten barns and burned paper trails. Back at the cabin, Elijah placed the muddy notepad on the table and began gathering old contacts, names he hadn't said aloud in years. Ranchers, auctioneers, people who knew how the underworld worked behind the livestock industry's clean facade. And as the fire crackled behind him, Rook curled on the rug again, this time not facing the door but Elijah, because now they were no longer 2 survivors. They were a unit with a mission, and the truth was no longer buried. Elijah didn't waste time. The very next morning, after barely a few sips of bitter coffee, he loaded the dog into the pickup and headed east, straight toward Bozeman. The back of his mind buzzed with fragments of the night before. That shadow at the ranch, the old fence posts that seemed to hide a graveyard's worth of secrets. But it was the dog that haunted him more. The way he had whimpered near the shallow earth. The way he had stared at Elijah like he knew everything. Bozeman was an hour out and the landscape grew flatter, more open. But Elijah's grip on the wheel tightened. With every passing mile, he hadn't been to this vet clinic in years. Not since he and Alina Merrick had stopped talking. After, well, a lot of silence, but if anyone knew how to read deeper than the wounds, it was her. The moment Elijah stepped through the door, the receptionist stiffened. "Dr. Merrick," she called out quickly, not even asking for a name. And then there she was, Elena. Sleeves rolled, eyes alert, wiping her hands with a stained cloth. She didn't smile. She didn't ask why he was there. Her gaze immediately dropped to the dog. The dog limped behind Elijah, then sat, barely, his body tense, eyes flicking between the 2 of them like he was reading every moment as a code. Alina approached slowly, crouched without a word, and placed a hand near the dog's neck. He didn't flinch. That more than anything told her something had changed. "Elijah," she finally said, standing back up. "Let's take a look." Inside the sterile exam room, the mood shifted. The dog remained calm, letting her lift his paw, run her hands along his rib cage. But when she gently parted the fur along his flank, she froze. "These aren't from a fence," she muttered. "These are intentional." Elijah's heart slowed in his chest. "What do you mean?" Alina didn't look at him. She focused on the old scar tissue, burn rings. moved to his chest, found another. This pattern, she began again, is usually from shock prods. The silence that followed was heavy. Shock prods. Elijah swallowed hard. His hands curled on his knees. He remembered the stories, rumors, on backcountry ranches about breaking aggressive dogs, making them fear, obey, or worse, turn violent for sport. Alina stepped back from the table and exhaled. He's not just abused. He's trained to survive something. No living thing should be made to survive. Then she pulled up a scan. There's a chip that changed everything. They both leaned in. The monitor blinked, pulling records from a dusty digital trail. When the name popped up, Elijah didn't breathe. Alina hesitated before reading it aloud. The dog had once been registered under a livestock holding facility, one Elijah knew all too well. Yellowstone County. Closed 5 years ago. Tied to a man who rarely showed his face but always got what he wanted. Elena's voice broke as she read the final line. Owner of record, Everett Roar. Elijah sat back, stunned. The name hit him like a freight train. Roar, the man behind the auctions. The man Elijah had once worked for when things had gone dark in his life. The man whose operation Elijah had tried to forget. But the dog hadn't forgotten. Rook's eyes didn't blink. He just turned his head slightly, watching Elijah, quiet as ever, as if to say, "You already knew." Alina didn't speak. Again. She could see Elijah was unraveling quietly in the corner of the room. He stood up slowly, wall to the door, then stopped. "Keep the scan," he said. "Don't erase anything." Outside, the wind had picked up. Elijah stood by the truck. Eyes closed, he whispered. Something that only the dog heard. Name, place, and a promise. Because now, it wasn't just about rescuing the dog from his past. It was about making sure no other soul, two-legged or four, was ever trapped under that same weight again. Elijah didn't sleep that night. The name on that file chased him in circles, ringing louder than the silence. In his cabin, Everett Rower. It wasn't just a memory. It was a door, one he had sealed shut years ago with a heavy lock, and buried in a part of himself he never wanted to revisit. But now it had swung wide open, and on the other side stood this dog, looking back at him like a reflection of everything Elijah had once walked away from. By sunrise, Elijah was sitting on the front porch with a thermos of lukewarm coffee. The dog lay nearby, his head resting on Elijah's boot, breathing steady but alert. The bond between them had changed deeper. He wasn't just a rescue anymore. He was a witness. Elijah stood, walked into the shed, and retrieved a box he hadn't touched in over a decade. Inside were fragments of a different life. Contractor IDs, old photographs, a paycheck stub with Roar's name scrolled across the top. Proof. Not the kind that would hold in court, but the kind that couldn't be ignored in a man's soul. He had worked for Roar once, shoeing horses, fixing trailers, patching fences. That was the surface job, but underneath it, all there were whispers, barking from sheds that were always locked, dogs that arrived and never left. Elijah had heard. It had seen too much and had done too little. He needed the money. He looked the other way. He walked when the air got too heavy with smoke and screams. And now that same evil had followed him. All the way to Bozeman, he called. Deputy Marshal Lance Dwyer. Short, clipped conversation. No questions, just a meeting. They sat at a quiet cafe in the corner of town, surrounded by the hum of normal life, and Elijah laid it out piece by piece. No embellishments, no excuses, just the truth. I knew Roar. I worked under him. I saw the cages. Dwyer's face stayed neutral, but his eyes narrowed. Why now? Elijah didn't answer with words. He pulled out the photo Alina had scanned from the dog's chip registry. A faded image of the dog, scarred but younger, standing inside a chain-link enclosure with a number stapled to the wall behind him. The lawman's expression cracked. You bought him, he muttered. From the auction. Elijah nodded. Didn't know it then, but now I do. Dwyer ran a hand through his beard. Roar vanished when the co-op collapsed. No paper trail, no residence. Just folded into the woods. Elijah leaned in, voice low. I can find him. The deputy didn't ask how. He knew men like Elijah, quiet, damaged, but with a compass that pointed truer than most. If you do, Dwyer said, don't do anything stupid. Elijah only smiled once, barely. Too late for that. Back at the cabin, the dog waited. When Elijah returned, the dog stood without command and walked to the door. He knew this wasn't just about healing anymore. It was about reckoning. The next day, Elijah packed the truck. Not much, just essentials. Rope, first aid, a flashlight, an old revolver he hadn't touched in years. The dog hopped into the passenger seat, without hesitation, like they had done